Tell me, do you believe you could survive fighting orphans? And I'm not talking about children here. The change brought upon a catastrophic event: orphans. In today's video, the question I'm asking is, would society survive the change? Now, it does seem our world differs in a few ways compared to the world of Cronos in terms of technology. It seems they were a few years ahead compared to us in 1981 when the change occurred. So now for this scenario, let's say basically everything happened the same, with the only difference being the timeline. Before we can go over the fight for humanity's survival, we must first understand the change and the fall. We need to understand how Cronos' world dealt and fell against the disease. Let's begin with what the change is. During a mining incident in the steelworks of the city of Nowa Huta, in Poland, a dormant disease was released by an explosion. The initial impact killed most of the miners, and the survivors contracted the disease. Once infected, the virus ran rampant through a person's body. Symptoms include high fevers, hallucinations, eyesight deterioration, and severe aggression. Eventually, some people attempted to remove those inflicted from ground zero, and in doing so released the virus into their world. The disease is highly infectious and spread like wildfire across the world. We saw how the military attempted to contain the steelworks and ultimately fell. However, once the final stages of the disease were reached, those infected were doomed. In the final stages, a person would begin presenting a type of mutation in their bodies. Parts of their body would begin merging with each other. At this point, there was nothing that could be done to save their life. Furthermore, it would appear as if it became necessary for people to fuse with others to survive. All the orphans appear to have multiple people merge, creating amalgamations of an imitation of a person. There were only a few that didn't seem to have merged, but their bodies were utterly altered, like the headless runner and the unmerged one. These new creatures are called orphans, and shortly after their appearance, the fall occurred. The world became overwhelmed by the disease and seemed incapable of containing the virus. We learned the government attempted to quarantine people to help slow down the disease, but it was ultimately fruitless. We can only assume the rest of the world had the same devastating results. Now what remains are roaming orphans in search of others to merge with. And the cats. Oh, the cats. My personal theory about these innocent cats is that they aren't so innocent. In fact, I believe these cats are the true villains of the world of Cronos. Whether they are the collective or the ones responsible for the disease is left to speculation. I mean, think about it. The rest of the world, including animals, seem to have died except cats. Also, we're never given an explanation as to how these cats seem to have cores, the main ingredient necessary for travelers to get stronger. The only explanation is that they are members, if not the masterminds of the collective. Anyways, I digress. So let's get back to the fall. Sometime after the event, something would occur to the world. I'm not too sure about this, so if anybody knows, please put it in the comments. Anomalies begin to appear, tearing the world apart and distorting gravity in some kind of manner. This could be a direct result from the collective who used time travel, almost as if these time rifts and distortions were caused by the collective. Or maybe the anomaly occurred and the collective figured out a method to utilize the rifts to time travel. Now let's get down to it and see whether our world would collapse to the same disease. For this scenario, the year will be 2025 and it will have two categories. One where the virus is released but the anomaly never happens. The second will be exactly the same as the world of Cronos. The reason why is because I myself have no idea when these anomalies came to be, making it harder to determine how our world would have been affected in the fight against the orphans. Right, so let's say the same incident occurred in the same country. Well, the population doesn't seem to have changed much from 1981 to current time except for a few million people. I couldn't find any exact numbers for 1981, but currently the military size of Poland is somewhere around 200,000 soldiers. So more than likely there would be more soldiers to fight against the orphans compared to 1981. With better technology and advancements in medicine, you'd assume we'd be better off than the people of Nowa Huta. But if past events have taught us anything, is that there is no way in hell we could prevent the disease from spreading. I mean, look at the Big C and how the world responded to it. And I'm not saying the Big C wasn't a big deal, but compared to the change, it's like a coughing baby versus an atomic bomb. And purely based on those events that occurred not too long ago, you best bet the whole world will turn against each other. We were the greatest threat to ourselves during that time. During those few years of the Big C, people showed their true colors, and we saw how ineffective the governments were at handling such an epidemic. It would only be a matter of time for people to turn against each other, and it becomes all about themselves and screw anybody else. So back to the scenario, after the explosion in the first orphans, the government of Poland would probably react the same way the Cronos world did. Soldiers would be sent and secure samples to study it, but like the Cannon event, the virus would be released and spread rapidly. However, things would be a little different this time. For starters, the military would probably be able to fend off the initial attacks. At first, the soldiers might struggle, but once we learned their weakness to fire, things would become manageable. As scientists studied the disease, the soldiers would fight back, resulting in a longer time to find a cure. This would only delay the inevitable, as soldiers would slowly start getting sick themselves, and aid to them from other countries would be difficult as they would be plagued by the same thing. However, this time, the scientists could send their research and cooperate with the CDC and other organizations to find a cure. In the world of Cronos, it seemed they only had time to monitor and study the disease for a short time before they were all dead. Eventually, the Pathfinder and Veronica began working on a cure. They got very close until things went wrong and Veronica got sick. Based on the events of the Big C, the world scientists scurried to find a cure to combat the virus. They were only able to create vaccines which half the world believes were ineffective. Whether or not the vaccines actually worked, it does seem like the scientists could work quick enough to potentially find some type of vaccine, if only to delay the inevitable. I believe the CDC or some other organization could potentially find some type of vaccine to either slow down the virus or prevent infection. Now, my main reasoning for this is if two people were close to finding a cure, then hundreds, if not thousands of scientists should be able to do the same. And if anything else, they could create the same poison Veronica created to combat the hives caused by the disease. The question now is, how many people survived before the first batches of vaccines were released? Well, if we go based on the Big C, we can say roughly 700 million people got infected. If we use those same numbers of infected individuals compared to our world population of about 8.2 billion, we can see that about 7.5 billion people would remain. Now let's be honest, how many of us would survive against an orphan? Those numbers didn't even include all the soldiers' deaths accumulated during the fighting. I honestly think most communities would fall to such threats. A large majority of the world is now overweight, unfit, most do not have access to guns, and even if they did, most people cannot fight. Once we learned of their weakness to fire, people would begin setting fires all across, creating wildfires, causing more damage rather than helping. So realistically, how many would fall fighting against the orphans? Well, at first, I think millions, if not billions, would fall even before a vaccine was created. After which, all those corpses would only aid the orphans even further, as now they probably begin merging with them. Larger hives and stronger enemies would begin appearing all across. The spike-spitting armored orphans and terrors would surely cause more devastation. Those with guns would probably take out the normal and smaller orphans, but once they begin merging, only a few would be taken out by ordinary citizens. This would leave the military as the main force against the orphans. Let's say about 2 billion people died before the vaccines were created, if they were even created at all. All those bodies would further the enemy's strength. However, now we wouldn't get infected, but it does raise a new question. Would the vaccine prevent orphans from using our bodies, either to merge or to create hives? If yes, then the chances for survival would be higher. If not, well, may all the gods have mercy on us. For this scenario, let's say the virus prevented our bodies from being used for merging. There would still be millions, if not billions, of dead bodies that could be used. Once these bigger threats begin to appear like Mother Eliza and terrors, the war would shift for a while. In fact, they would probably cause the governments to begin using nukes to gain more time. I do believe after a while of fighting, we would probably develop better weapons to use against these new enemies, but after all this, I think a large portion of the population would die, somewhere between 40 to 70%, if not more. If we were unable to find a vaccine, then I think a few bastions would remain, like small towns or isolated areas that managed to secure themselves against the virus. Without the vaccine, the numbers would probably be somewhere between 90 to 99% of the world population would fall. Ultimately, though, I don't think we could go extinct, and I believe the virus could have been defeated with the creation of the vaccine. The fact we learned of their main weakness to fire, we would be able to fend off against their attacks for a while longer. For the second scenario, let's say things went basically the same. Poland becomes infected first and the virus begins to spread rapidly. Our first responders would attempt to help as much as possible with no avail. We saw how horribly it went when they attempted to quarantine people in the apartment buildings. But like the first scenario, our military would more than likely fight them off for a little while. Since I don't know when the first anomalies began to appear, if at the start or a later time, I'll use both in this what if. Let's say the anomalies began to appear shortly after the orphans. This threat isn't like the disease. We can't kill it or stop it. The world would begin to suffer from these anomalies and anarchy would ensue. The governments wouldn't know how to respond as our infrastructure would begin to rip apart. Gravity itself would turn against us. In the confusion, the orphans and the disease would spread quicker. I think give or take about half of the world's efforts would be devoted to understanding the anomaly, weakening our position against the orphans. I actually think the world would have been extremely blindsided by a second threat that governments would begin to collapse a whole lot sooner. Now, this doesn't mean we're all dead. I think people would still continue to have a strong foothold against the orphans, but depending on how bad things got, all the scientists working on the vaccines could have died. Without those vaccines, the exact same thing would happen to us as it did to the world of Cronos. The fall would still happen, except this time it would take longer for humanity to lose, but this isn't to say all the humans die. With our current technology, I think we'd find a way to coexist with the orphans. Maybe a poison would be created or a vaccine down the way, but I think at least a handful of people would survive. If the anomalies begin to occur after the fall, then two things could happen. One, we created the vaccine and began the counterattack against the orphans, but with the introduction of the anomaly, we would be fucked from the rear. The rules would suddenly change, making it an entirely different game. If we chose to ignore the anomaly, then we might have a chance of killing all those stinky orphans. But in this timeline, a higher percentage of the population would probably die, and more than likely we wouldn't find a way to revert or stop the anomaly. The second thing that could occur with the introduction of the anomaly is an utter halt to the war efforts. We still don't know how the anomaly affects the world, but from what we do know, everything is now fucked. The armies could potentially lose and more people would die, especially without a vaccine. Without it, I think most if not all of the world would die like in Cronos. However, even if we had a vaccine, the war against the orphans could come to a stop. Rather, society could wall off sections or create strongholds secluded from the orphans and learn to live with orphans and the anomaly. Meaning it could take years, if not decades, for us to wipe out orphans and learn to live with our new world. The verdict is in, and the final word is society survives only if we manage to create a vaccine. Without that vaccine, I don't think there is any chance in hell we could survive. In terms of killing the orphans, we'd have a great time. But as the disease continues to spread, our numbers would begin to dwindle until eventually we don't have the numbers to fight back. There could be potential areas where people survive, but with the anomaly, most secure areas would be lost. However, there could be a chance we utilize the anomaly to keep ourselves safe. Heck, maybe we can do the same thing as a collective and learn to time travel, but who knows? That is the end of the video. Even though it's fun to think how we fare against the orphans, this world is too whack to want to live in. Just seeing your loved ones turn into grotesque amalgamations of biomass would be enough to make people lose their minds. But if I got anything wrong or you have a different theory, please let me know. Like, sub, or don't, as long as you enjoy the video.